And, you know, the mechanistic paradigm, the Cartesian mechanistic paradigm, where we treat matter as more real than energy. If you look at a lot of indigenous societies, they kind of transcended this a long time ago, and they treat things that are more ethereal.
Well, they never got into it to begin with.
They never got into it, and they realized that there are a lot of subtle effects that you need to look at. And I'm always amazed when you look at some of the abilities of indigenous peoples, because the ancient Polynesians could navigate the entire Pacific Ocean. They didn't have GPS. You and I can't do that nowadays. We'd get lost. They were about 20 different things that they looked at, you know, stars and birds, wave patterns. Those are all sort of more subtle phenomena that, if you know, normally you wouldn't pay attention to because you wouldn't think they're relevant. And yet, in that situation, it allowed them to navigate back and forth. And so, and the Aborigine people of Australia had these sort of songs, you know, these walk lines and these songs that they would sing that they passed down from generation to generation. They could use these song lines to navigate the entire continent of Australia. It was like an auditory map. Isn't that amazing? So basically, paying attention to these subtle phenomena, even with ordinary, regular, everyday things, actually has a lot of benefits in terms of paying attention. Actually, that's what I call planetary intelligence. The bottom line here, Joe, we have narrowed our focus to a very narrow bandwidth and called that reality, and anything outside of that is considered to be, in a derogatory term, paranormal. We need to expand the bandwidth because there are a lot of things there that can be useful to us, including energy. You've heard of zero-point energy. This is one sort of phenomena, energy right from the vacuum of space-time. So there's a lot of things that could be useful to us, be helpful, if we just opened our minds a little bit and said, we don't need to be afraid of these things, we don't need to marginalize them, we're going to embrace them and take a look what's going on.
And the ancients, but it seems that the ancients had a different methodology. So I wonder if the methodology we're using, you know, experimentation and all the scientific tools that we use, if that methodology itself would ultimately have to expand or change in order for us to get to the levels that are possible and that the ancients already got to. I mean, they didn't sit there and go, well, we did this experiment, this double-blind experiment, and we found that this happened. They didn't do it that way. They did it through direct experience, I think. They did it through direct observation. So why couldn't that become in some way, a valid tool for investigation of knowledge?
It's a really good point.
That's agreed upon. That's not just considered subjective.
It's a very good point, Joe. It's a very good point. We have this kind of certain litmus test of what we consider to be real, and it basically has to pass this kind of double-blind, controlled sort of
So I wonder how much is going to be, can we get in that way, where we might get to a point where we have to change methodologies here and agree upon the validity of those changes.
You know, there are people that agree with you about this. You know, one is, you've heard of Dr. William Tiller, who's done all these experiments with these, sort of the way information is communicated. And he's found that, you know, meditation can affect the objects. They'll take two objects like glasses of water. They'll have experienced meditators meditate on one glass and the other's the control. And there'll be different properties in the glass that the meditators meditated upon than the other one.
Right.
Well, Tiller believes that you really don't ever have double-blind controlled studies, because if his research is correct, this information is moving through, he calls what a reciprocal space, another type of space right here with us that we can't see. The information is moving kind of under the surface. If that's true, if you get this communication going on all the time, you never would have really a double-blind experiment, because the information could already come back perhaps.
There's no need for one.
Well, what it does, the whole point of that is to try to weed out the difference between normal circumstances and where you really see an effect. The challenge with it is, and what you're hinting at, is are you kind of eliminating certain types of phenomena that could be real because you're
limited by your methodology.
Yeah, it's almost like what you're saying, Joe. It's almost like that story we've all heard where you have, you know, you got guys looking underneath a street light, and someone comes along saying, "Why are you looking there?" He said, "I lost my keys."
Right.
And he says, "Well, that's where the light is." And this is the real point: is are we missing 98% of what's going on because we're so focused, and because these institutions tend to get, academic institutions especially, tend to get so conservative that they never really want to change until something really new. Do you think people were happy with Einstein when he came along back in the early 1900s with his ideas? I remember this book, Joe. I saw this book in the library in the stacks in college. It was called 100 Scientists Prove Einstein Wrong. It was written in 1920. And all these 100 scientists had signed their names to this book. And we don't remember a single name of those scientists now, but we still remember Einstein. New ideas are never popular. And if you look at the history of science, Joe, I'm sure you're well aware of this, and our audience too. New ideas are almost completely shunned. Do you remember the Wright brothers were considered a hoax 2 years
Regardless,
after they flew?
Right.
Because the newspaper people, Scientific American said it was a hoax. The newspapers at the time called Scientific American for their opinion about this. Should they do the story? And Scientific Americans, no, it's things that are heavier than air cannot fly. Hello. And no one investigated it. They had to fly down the streets of Charleston, South Carolina to
convince them.
We are always very resistant to change. We're in that time period right now. What ends up happening to civilizations like us, it becomes so uncomfortable after a while not to change that you basically you say, okay, let's try something new because the old.
And you have so much investment in this particular methodology or this particular paradigm that's been created that it's like like losing your baby. Oh my God, I have to lose all this we've worked so hard for.
Well, I mean, Detroit has had a certain investment in certain types of cars for a long time, but that's not working anymore. They're having to switch to new models.
Which is hard for them, I'm sure.
The Obama administration that makes them do this.
Right.
It's very hard because they're very comfortable with a certain modality. But, things change. And after a while, if you don't get with the picture and with the program, history leaves you behind.
It happens on an individual level, too. I mean, we think we know who we are, and we're resistant to looking at the possibility that maybe we don't.
We have no idea who we are. What we are is basically a story that we've been told by the institutions that were around.
And then we've repeated within ourselves.
Pretty much.
Hypnotize ourselves.
And that's a very good point. We have a story about ourselves and our society, but, this is the point of history. Sometimes you read alternative histories of the United States and you realize it wasn't exactly the way you learned in grade school. Maybe Columbus didn't really discover it.
Well, or just the people's history, like Howard Zinn or something.
Exactly.
How about from their perspective?
And you get this in archaeology all the time. And Joe, even in conventional science magazines and science, there are these debates going on when new evidence is found, footprints. There's some footprints found by a lake in Mexico, and they say maybe people were here actually in 20,000 BC, but previously, and that's a big shift to go back 10,000 more years. But there are other archaeologists that sometimes say, look, we found ball bearings in this coal mine in South Africa. The coal is 2.8 billion years old.
Or Michael Cremo, who finds
exactly what I'm referring to.
He's human prints or humanoid type prints next to dinosaurs. I mean,
right, and there's many cases in the U.S. where bodies have been found buried below sheets of rock that we know are a certain age, which must mean that these people are older than that. Now, when you present that to conventional academics, what are they going to say? It's a hoax. Why? Because we know that there weren't people here before 10,000 BC. But it even happens with very conventional sort of debates about this. You've heard this debate over the so-called Hobbit skeletons that were found in Indonesia. Homo florenza, I think it's called, something to that effect. It's basically this island in Indonesia. Now, they had an episode on 60 Minutes about this, and they talked to the local people. They all had this mythology of the little people that their parents and grandparents had told them about, little 3-foot, 4-foot high people. Well, they found the skeletons of this. Now, what did the conventional scientists say? That they were suffering.
They were freaks.
Exactly. They were suffering. It was a whole group of people suffering from a disease. Some type
of
microencephaly or something like this. And I've been reading about this debate, and basically, do you know who ended up winning were the people that were saying it was another species of Homo sapiens, because they looked at the wrist and the hand and they said, this is not consistent with people that have that disease. So even in something that seems as kind of prosaic as something like that, there are these fierce debates. Now imagine you come to our topics that we're talking about here. It goes beyond fierce to skepticism to type of scoffing, where it's not even willing to look at the evidence. If you look at the evidence for a variety of these topics that we're talking about here, you're going to see there's lots of evidence, including UFOs and extraterrestrials from very reliable sources. It's just so outside the ballpark for conventional thinking that our minds they're like, it's like our mindset shuts down. It's like a rubber band effect. You just say, it can't be true. We all experience this. Joe, and you and I are not immune to this either. But this is what we're dealing with in our society right now. And this crisis that we're experiencing economically and otherwise is a self-manufactured crisis by our lack of ability to adapt to changing conditions.
So let's get a little bit into that. So there's this resistance, there's this, this adherence, this dedication, this faith, in this particular paradigm that we're going to grab onto unless we're forced out of it. It seems to be part of human nature, at least at this point.